A rich tourist, accustomed to living a life of luxury and privilege, had always believed that his wealth could protect him from the consequences of his actions. On a vacation in a foreign country, he found himself at a popular tourist attraction, where tourists from all over the world came to admire the traditions and history of the place. Among the many sights were the royal guards, dressed in their traditional uniforms, standing still and unflinching as part of a long-standing ceremonial tradition. The tourist had seen these guards before, but on this particular day, something about them caught his eye in a way that it hadn't before. Perhaps it was the heat, or perhaps the thrill of being in a new country with no real sense of responsibility. But as the tourist walked past the guards, a thought crossed his mind. It wasn't the kind of thought you would expect from someone who had been taught respect for others. No, this thought came from a place of arrogance and disregard. He looked at the royal guard standing in front of him and thought, what if I could make this boring tradition a little more interesting? This moment wasn't about mischief or innocent fun. It was about proving a point. The tourist had always seen himself as someone who could do anything he wanted without facing consequences, and today he felt the need to make a statement. Without thinking of the repercussions, he pulled out a can of paint from his bag, a can he had brought along to take artistic photos for his social media page. His hands trembled slightly, not out of fear, but out of excitement for the reaction he believed he would get. As he walked up to the royal guard, the tourist thought about how absurd it was that someone could stand so still, almost as if they were invisible. How can anyone be this serious, just standing here all day? He muttered under his breath. With that, he aimed the can of paint at the guard and sprayed it onto his uniform. At first, nothing happened. The guard did not move. The tourist waited for the shock, the gasps of other tourists who might be around, but it didn't come. The air was still, and it seemed like the entire world was frozen for a moment. The royal guard stood there, unflinching, just as he had been trained. The tourist chuckled to himself, thinking that he had pulled off something clever, unaware of the chain of events he had set into motion. What he didn't realize was that the guard's silence was not out of confusion or surprise. It was out of discipline. The royal guard knew exactly how to handle situations like this. He didn't react because he wasn't allowed to. He wasn't supposed to show anger or frustration. He was there to serve, to maintain his composure no matter what happened around him. The tourist, satisfied with the outcome, thought he had made a memorable moment. Little did he know, this would be the moment that would change his life forever. As the first few whispers and murmurs began to spread through the crowd, he could hear the faint sounds of people reaching for their phones, taking pictures and recording the scene. The tourist smiled, believing that soon everyone would see what he had done. He hadn't just stood out from the crowd. He had made history in his own eyes. But that very smile would soon fade as the consequences of his thoughtless actions began to take shape. The moment the tourist thought he had pulled off the perfect prank, he was unaware of the storm he had just started. The initial silence after he sprayed the paint on the royal guard's uniform was only the calm before the storm. It wasn't long before the crowd of onlookers began murmuring among themselves. Some were shocked, others were annoyed, and a few even seemed uncomfortable with what had just happened. The tourist's cocky grin faded as he began to sense that something was off. At first, he thought it was just the crowd's confusion, but the longer he stood there, the more he realized that the reaction wasn't what he had expected. He heard whispers of outrage, some directed at him, some directed at the royal guard, but all of them filled with tension. He could feel eyes on him, many of them not filled with admiration, but with judgment. The tourists who had gathered around him seemed to quickly lose interest in the spectacle he had created, their gazes shifting to the guard instead of the person who had caused the scene. The tourist glanced around nervously. He had never felt this kind of attention before. It was a mixture of confusion and discomfort. Then, out of nowhere, two local law enforcement officers appeared, making their way through the crowd with swift, deliberate steps. Their faces were stern, their presence commanding. The tourist's heart began to race. He had seen this kind of reaction before. People of authority always seemed to notice him when he mispaved. But today, he didn't feel as confident as he usually did. The reality of his actions was starting to sink in. The officers approached the royal guard first. They exchanged a few quick words, but the guard didn't speak much. His silence was a part of his training, a display of professionalism that the officers respected. Without hesitation, the officers turned toward the tourist. The tourist, trying to keep his cool, straightened up and flashed them a smile. But it wasn't the confident, charming smile he had once relied on. It was a nervous, forced grin, and deep down, he could feel the weight of his mistake pressing down on him. One of the officers asked him to step aside. He didn't argue. It wasn't just the law that was on his mind, but the growing realization that the scene he had created was beginning to spiral out of his control. As the officers began to ask questions, the tourist's mind raced. He tried to explain that it was just a joke, just a harmless prank, but the officers didn't seem to buy it. They didn't see the humor in his actions, and their stern expressions made it clear that they were taking the situation seriously. As the tourist stood there, nervously shifting his weight from one foot to the other, the crowd grew larger. More people had gathered, some from the surrounding shops, others simply passing by, eager to see what would happen next. The tourist's thoughts started to race. I didn't mean for this to get out of hand. Why is everyone making such a big deal out of it? But the truth was, the situation was out of his control. The royal guard was a symbol of respect and tradition, and the tourist had just disrespected that tradition. He hadn't just made a fool of himself, he had angered an entire nation. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and it was clear that the incident was being recorded on smartphones. The tourist realized that this moment, this mistake, was about to be shared with the world. His face went pale as he began to feel the weight of his actions. The attention he had craved only moments earlier now felt suffocating. His fun had come at a cost, and it was a cost far greater than he had ever imagined. As the officers continued questioning the tourist, he could feel his confidence slipping away. The initial excitement he had felt moments ago now felt like a distant memory. He had always been used to getting out of tricky situations with charm or a little bit of money, but this was different. The officers weren't buying his explanations, and it seemed like they weren't interested in his excuses. He tried to brush it off, but deep down, he knew this wasn't something he could easily talk his way out of. The royal guard stood quietly in the background, his uniform now stained with the paint the tourist had thrown on him. Despite the situation, the guard maintained his calm composure, not showing a hint of frustration or anger. His silence seemed to speak volumes to the crowd, and the tourist began to realize just how serious the situation was. The guard's professionalism, combined with the growing tension in the air, made it clear that this wasn't going to be a simple matter to fix. The crowd had grown even larger, with people now taking photos and videos. The tourist felt exposed, trapped in the spotlight of his own making. What started as a thoughtless prank now felt like a huge mistake. As the officers continued their investigation, it became clear that the tourist's actions were being taken seriously. He could hear snippets of conversations around him, with some people expressing anger, others disbelief. They all seemed to share the same sentiment. The tourist had crossed a line. Before long, the officers informed the tourist that they would have to take him into custody. The shock hit him like a wave. He had never imagined that something like this could escalate so quickly. He had expected a scolding, maybe a small fine, but not this. The weight of the situation settled over him as he was escorted away from the crowd, his face red with embarrassment. In the meantime, the royal guard stood by, still silent, as if nothing had happened. The officers began to speak to him, gathering his side of the story and taking down his details. The guard's professionalism shone through even in this moment of conflict, and the tourist couldn't help but feel a mix of guilt and frustration. He hadn't just ruined his own day. He had made things difficult for the guard, who was now dealing with the mess the tourist had created. Back at the local police station, the tourist was forced to confront the consequences of his actions. He was given time to cool down and reflect on the chain of events he had set in motion. His mind raced as he thought about how things had gotten so out of hand. It was just a joke, he kept telling himself, but he knew deep down that it was more than that. The respect that the Royal Guard represented had been violated, and the public, including the authorities, weren't about to let him off the hook. As the hours passed, the tourist's situation grew more dire. He had made a mistake, one that he couldn't take back. What had seemed like a harmless act of defiance now felt like a life-altering decision. He began to feel the full weight of his mistake, realizing that the fallout from this incident was just beginning. The world wasn't going to forget what he had done, and the consequences were more severe than he could have ever imagined. The tourist could only hope that this would be a lesson, not just for himself, but for anyone who thought they could act without considering the bigger picture. The following days were nothing like the tourist had ever imagined. What had seemed like a harmless prank, a bit of fun in a foreign land, quickly turned into a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. After he was released from custody, the gravity of his actions hit him hard. His phone buzzed constantly, filled with messages, missed calls, and alerts from the news. The incident had gone viral. Pictures and videos of the tourist pouring paint on the Royal Guard were everywhere, on social media, in newspapers, and on television. The world was watching, and the attention was not the kind he had hoped for. At first, the tourist tried to ignore it. He told himself that it would blow over, that people would forget. After all, he had the money and resources to make things go away, didn't he? But he quickly realized that this wasn't something that could be swept under the rug. The outrage was far greater than he had anticipated. People from all walks of life, from different countries, had taken offense to what he did. It wasn't just the local community that was upset. People from all over the world were condemning his actions. His social media accounts, once filled with glamorous photos and status updates, were now flooded with angry comments, many of which called for him to be held accountable. His family, too, began to feel the pressure. His parents, who had always been proud of their son's success and the life he had built, were now facing questions from their friends and acquaintances. They didn't know how to respond to the barrage of negative attention. His father, who had always taught him to be respectful and humble, was disappointed. The tourist could sense the change in their relationship, the distance that began to form as the days went on. In the media, the story took on a life of its own. The Royal Guard, whose dignity had been disrespected, became a symbol of resilience and professionalism. The public admired his ability to remain calm in the face of such provocation. News outlets ran stories not just about the incident, but about the history and significance of the Royal Guard, making the tourist's actions seem even more disrespectful. The spotlight had shifted from him to the Guard, and the world now saw the contrast between the two. The calm, composed figure of the Royal Guard versus the arrogant tourist who thought he could break the rules without facing the consequences. It wasn't long before the legal consequences began to make themselves known. Authorities had taken the matter seriously from the start, and now they were moving forward with charges. The tourist, who had always been able to rely on his wealth to get out of tight spots, realized that this time it wasn't going to work. His legal team began working overtime, but it wasn't enough to stop the tide of public opinion or the momentum of the case against him. The charges weren't minor either. They were serious, and the potential penalties could cost him far more than money. His reputation, which had once been his greatest asset, was now tarnished beyond repair. As the case progressed, the tourist found himself constantly facing questions and criticism from all sides. People who once admired him for his success now looked at him with disdain. Even his business associates, some of whom had long supported him, began to distance themselves. Contracts were canceled, partnerships dissolved, and invitations to high-profile events were rescinded. He had become a pariah, the subject of ridicule and scorn. The world had made it clear. His actions had consequences, and no amount of wealth could shield him from them. The more he tried to defend himself, the worse it became. He gave interviews in which he tried to apologize, but his words only seemed to dig him deeper into trouble. He spoke about the situation as though it was a mistake, as if it could all be explained away with a simple apology. But the public wasn't interested in excuses. What they wanted was accountability. The tourist, for the first time in his life, was forced to confront the fact that not everything could be solved with money, charm, or influence. He had made a mistake, and now he was paying the price for it. The situation grew more complicated as the days passed. The tourist, now facing the full brunt of the consequences, couldn't escape the ever-growing pressure. The media, once fascinated by his wealth and lifestyle, now painted him as an arrogant and thoughtless figure, a cautionary tale for anyone who thought they could act without consequences. His every move was scrutinized, every statement twisted into something that seemed to make him look worse. He was beginning to feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. In court, the atmosphere was tense. The case against him had moved swiftly. The public was eager for accountability, and the prosecutor made sure to emphasize how the tourist's actions had disrespected not only the royal guard, but the culture and traditions of the country. The royal guard, now a symbol of dignity and respect, stood firm in his testimony, sharing the emotional toll the incident had taken on him. It wasn't just the paint that had hurt, it was the humiliation of being disrespected in front of an entire crowd. The tourist had never considered the deeper consequences of his actions. To him, it had been a simple prank, but now he saw how much damage it had caused. The legal battle was long and stressful. The tourist's defense, which had initially seemed solid, started to crumble under the weight of public opinion. He tried to explain that he had no intention of causing harm, that it was all a misunderstanding. But the more he spoke, the less convincing he sounded. The words, "It was just a joke," became his fallback, but the public wasn't buying it. They didn't see it as a joke. They saw it as an act of disrespect, an arrogant display of privilege from someone who thought the rules didn't apply to him. The legal team he had hired, once full of hope, now struggled to keep up with the mounting pressure. As the trial continued, the tourist began to understand just how much damage he had done, not just to the royal guard and the people around him, but to himself. He had always relied on his charm, his wealth, and his status to navigate the world. But in this case, none of those things mattered. Money couldn't fix this. No amount of charm could undo what had been done. The tourist, for the first time in his life, felt powerless. The consequences of his actions began to spread beyond the courtroom. His business deals faltered, clients pulled out, and the brand he had spent years building crumbled. No one wanted to be associated with him anymore. He was no longer the confident, successful figure he once was. He was the man who had disrespected a royal guard and an entire nation. The social media backlash continued to intensify. People who had once admired his life of luxury now saw him as a symbol of everything that was wrong with the world. A rich, entitled person who believed he could do whatever he wanted without facing consequences. Despite his mounting problems, the tourist tried to maintain an air of confidence. He continued to attend business meetings, but it was clear that his heart wasn't in it anymore. His mind was consumed by the trial, by the pressure, by the overwhelming realization that he had made a massive mistake. Even the luxury of his lifestyle felt like a distant memory. The joy he had once found in expensive dinners, extravagant vacations, and lavish events had faded. Nothing could distract him from the reality of what he had done. At home, the tourist sat in silence, looking out of the window, reflecting on how everything had gone wrong. He had been so sure of himself, so certain that he could get away with anything. But now, the consequences were inescapable. His life had changed in ways he couldn't have imagined. The fame he had once enjoyed had turned to infamy, and he was left to grapple with the harsh truth. The world wasn't impressed by his wealth or status anymore. The world wanted respect, and he had lost that, along with so much more. The weight of the situation was starting to feel unbearable. The tourist's life, once so full of promise and luxury, was now unraveling. Every day brought new challenges, new reminders of his mistake. The legal battle continued to drag on, with more and more media coverage highlighting his downfall. What had seemed like an embarrassing moment at the time had now become a full-scale disaster. The public's anger didn't seem to fade, and the more the tourist tried to apologize, the more it seemed like his words fell on deaf ears. His business, once thriving, was now on the brink of collapse. Clients that had previously been loyal now distanced themselves. The phone calls stopped coming, the emails were fewer, and those who once considered him a partner now saw him as a liability. The wealthy lifestyle he had once taken for granted was slowly slipping away. His penthouse apartment, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a prison. There was no escaping the consequences of his actions. Friends who had once been close began to pull away as well. The invitations to social gatherings stopped coming. People who had been more than happy to be seen with him in the past now refused to even acknowledge his presence. The tourist felt isolated. The social networks he had spent years building were beginning to collapse around him. He tried to maintain his usual carefree attitude, but it was harder and harder to do so with every passing day. The media coverage, which had initially been focused on the incident with the Royal Guard, had now expanded. Every article, every piece of commentary, seemed to pile on more criticism. The tourist was no longer just the man who had made a foolish mistake. He was now the face of entitled arrogance, a symbol of how unchecked privilege could lead to disastrous consequences. The endless news coverage made it impossible for him to escape the consequences of that one impulsive moment. The trial was nearing its conclusion, and the tourist couldn't shake the feeling that things were not going in his favor. His legal team, once confident they could win the case, was now struggling to keep up. The charges against him were serious, and the public outcry made it clear that the jury wasn't likely to be sympathetic. The more the tourist tried to explain himself, the more it seemed like his defense fell apart. The Royal Guard's testimony, calm and collected, contrasted sharply with the tourist's increasingly desperate tone. The courtroom was tense, and the pressure was mounting. At home, the tourist spent sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the guilt that weighed on him. He couldn't help but think about how he had taken everything for granted. His wealth, his status, his privilege, they had all made him feel untouchable. He had never thought about how his actions might affect others. It was only now, when everything had started to fall apart, that he realized just how wrong he had been. As the trial drew closer to its end, the reality of his situation hit harder than ever. The court, the media, and the public had made up their minds, and the tourist felt powerless. His reputation, his wealth, and his influence had failed him. In the face of the overwhelming backlash, he was forced to confront a simple but painful truth. There were some mistakes that money couldn't fix, and no amount of influence could undo the damage caused. All the privileges he had once relied on now seemed meaningless in comparison to the consequences of his thoughtless decision. It was clear now. This was not just a momentary setback. It was the end of a chapter in his life, and the beginning of something new. Whether he wanted to accept it or not, the tourist knew he would have to face the consequences, no matter how difficult they might be. The trial had come to an end, and the tourist found himself standing at the edge of a new reality. He was no longer the arrogant, untouchable figure he once thought himself to be. The once popular businessman, admired for his charm and wealth, was now a man who had to face the consequences of his actions. The courtroom was tense as the judge delivered the verdict. The charges against him were serious, and the evidence had been stacked against him. Despite his best efforts, the tourist couldn't deny that his mistake had been significant, and now it was time for him to pay the price. The sentence was delivered, and though it wasn't as harsh as some had hoped, it was enough to send a strong message. He was fined a substantial amount, which felt like a mere fraction of what he had lost already. But the true punishment was the public shame. the feeling of being a pariah in a world where his reputation had once been everything. The tourist felt a sense of dread as he walked out of the courthouse, knowing that the real cost of his mistake couldn't be measured in money or legal fees. It was the irreversible damage to his name and career. As the weeks passed, the effects of the verdict started to sink in. His business ventures, which had once been prosperous, were now hanging by a thread. Clients had cut ties with him, and many partners in his industry were now wary of associating with someone who had brought so much negative attention. The luxury apartments, the expensive cars, and the lavish lifestyle had all seemed so important at one point, but now they felt like distant memories. The tourist found himself selling off possessions just to keep afloat, and each sale was a painful reminder of how far he had fallen. It wasn't just his professional life that had been upended. His personal relationships, too, had been deeply affected. People he had considered friends now avoided him, unsure of how to react to his sudden fall from grace. The tourist had never imagined that something so simple as a thoughtless prank could ruin everything he had worked so hard for. And yet, here he was, facing the consequences of his arrogance. The friends who once admired him for his wealth and charm were now nowhere to be found, and those who remained seemed uncomfortable in his presence. The media coverage continued, though the stories had begun to lose their original fervor. The public had moved on to the next big scandal, but the tourist knew that his name would never be the same. He had been branded as the rich, entitled man who thought he could do whatever he wanted without facing any consequences. The public's perception of him was forever changed. No amount of apologies or public relations could fix that. He spent a lot of time alone in his apartment, reflecting on what had happened. The silence was deafening, and for the first time in his life, he found himself questioning the choices he had made. He had always believed that his wealth and status would shield him from the world's judgment. But now he understood that respect and humility were more valuable than money. The things he had once taken for granted, his wealth, his connections, his influence, no longer mattered. What mattered now was whether he could rebuild his life, not with money, but with character. The road to recovery seemed long and uncertain. The tourist had to make peace with the fact that he couldn't undo what had been done. But he also knew that the lessons he had learned through this experience were invaluable. He had lost everything, but in the process, he had gained a new perspective on life. It wasn't about wealth or power anymore. It was about how he treated others, how he respected those around him. If he could learn to live with humility, perhaps he could start to rebuild his life, one small step at a time. The tourist's journey was far from over, but it was clear that he would never be the same person again. The world had shown him the consequences of his actions, and now it was up to him to prove that he could rise from the ashes of his mistakes and become someone better. The road ahead would be difficult, but he had learned one crucial lesson. True change could only come from within. And so, he began to take the first tentative steps toward redemption. As time went on, the tourist found himself slowly picking up the pieces of his life, though it wasn't easy. He had lost so much. The luxury, the social status, the respect of his peers, and rebuilding from the bottom up was a daunting task. But with each passing day, he began to realize that the journey back wouldn't be defined by his wealth or the material things he had lost. Instead, it would be about his actions, his growth, and how he chose to move forward after the mistake that had changed everything. The public's view of him had become more forgiving over time, but the damage was still there. People had moved on to other stories, but for the tourist, the memory of what he had done would always stay with him. It wasn't just the judgment of others that haunted him. It was the regret of knowing he had disrespected something important. The royal guard had become more than just a symbol of authority. He represented a deep lesson in humility. The tourist had come to respect that, and in doing so, he began to change his perspective on what truly mattered in life. He started to make amends, quietly at first. He knew he couldn't undo the damage, but he could work toward becoming a better person, one who didn't take the world and its rules for granted. He reached out to people he had wronged, not expecting forgiveness, but hoping to show that he had learned from his mistakes. Some responded positively, while others were still wary. It didn't matter to him as much as it once would have. What mattered was that he was trying, and that was a start. Slowly, he began to rebuild his business, but this time, he did it with a new approach. He focused on integrity and building relationships based on trust, rather than relying on the old methods of charm and influence. He took smaller steps, working hard to show that he was someone who could be relied upon and respected. It was a long road, but with each success, no matter how small, he felt a bit more hopeful that he could rebuild his life on a stronger foundation. His relationships, too, started to change. Those who had once avoided him began to give him a second chance. He took care not to take anyone for granted again. He treated people with the respect they deserved, and slowly he began to earn their trust. Some old friends came back into his life, while others decided to stay away. But that didn't bother him as much as it might have in the past. He understood now that people had their own lives to live, and sometimes things couldn't be fixed overnight. One of the biggest changes, though, was in the way he saw the world. The tourist no longer saw people through the lens of power and influence. He saw them as individuals, each with their own struggles, challenges, and dreams. The idea of being better than someone simply because of his wealth seemed absurd to him now. Instead, he focused on how he could make a positive impact on others, no matter how small. It wasn't about showing off or trying to impress anyone. It was about contributing to the world in a meaningful way. The tourist's life would never be the same as it was before that fateful day when he poured paint on the royal guard. But in many ways, that was a blessing. He had learned the hard way that there were far more important things than wealth and status. The respect of others, the ability to treat people well, and the courage to admit when he was wrong were all far more valuable than any amount of money. His journey wasn't over, but he had made the choice to walk it with humility, and that made all the difference. As he looked back on everything that had happened, the tourist understood now that his biggest mistake had also been his greatest teacher. It had forced him to face the consequences of his actions, to reflect on who he was and who he wanted to be. And while the road ahead was still uncertain, he now walked it with a sense of purpose, a purpose to be better, to respect others, and to rebuild not just his life, but his character. The lessons he had learned would stay with him forever, and that was the true reward for the long, difficult journey he had undertaken.